Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to see you all this evening and talk about an issue I think that is very important to us, but the fact that you're here also suggests it's very important to you too, and it's a source of optimism and inspiration that we can fill a room like this on such a critical topic. So maybe I'll start by trying to combine the questions about why am I here and from what do I derive my optimism. I studied public international law and environmental law many years ago in law school, and I was looking for a way to bring those two things together. And it was in the early 1990s, and there was the end of the Cold War. There was a sense that there was a sort of a consensus that was emerging around liberal democracy, liberal economics that had to be balanced with something called sustainable development. That as we began to empower people to engage in policymaking by spreading democracy around the world, and we were opening up markets to provide opportunity for economies and people to grow, that we had to ensure that we were also taking into account environmental concerns and planetary limits. And that's when the first Earth Summit, the Rio Earth Summit, was convened, and where some of the first multilateral environmental agreements of a kind of a second generation of treaties began to emerge, including one that was intended to address climate change. Now, back then, the science of climate change was still pretty young in the sense of the scientists really being able to model accurately the predicted impacts of climate change. But the physics was just really simple and obvious. The more greenhouse gases you pump into the atmosphere, the more you're going to thicken that natural layer of gas that keeps the planet warm, and the warmer and warmer the planet is going to get. So even at that, decades ago, it was pretty obvious what the problem was and what the solution was to try to get countries to commit to reducing their emissions of greenhouse gases in line with what the science was trying to tell us. And so that was the problem definition, and I was looking for an opportunity to learn, to use some of the skills that I had learned in law school to apply it to that problem. And the response was, well, let's negotiate an international treaty that contains these kinds of obligations on states. So in 1992, we managed to conclude the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was an amazing event in the sense that it was the first internationally legally binding treaty with near universal participation aimed at addressing this challenge. And it had as its key objective making sure that we prevented the increase of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere so as to ensure that the planet would be safe. So a big, bold statement of objectives contained in a binding treaty that was essentially applicable to all parties. So that really kind of reconfirmed my optimism. However, the whole political process and the compromises that were necessary in order to agree that sort of high-level objective also became immediately evident to any lawyer that was reading that text. It contains no specific legally binding obligations on parties to achieve those long-term objectives. And we're still working, and we have been working over the past decades to try to fix that problem, that although nation states can agree to long-term objectives, it becomes much more difficult for them to commit and to sign up to very specific targets in order to achieve those. Since then, there have been a number of generations of international treaties that have tried to fix that problem. The Kyoto Protocol from 1997, as you know, contains legally binding targets, has quite a strong enforcement regime attached to it. It had introduced international carbon markets to sort of lower the cost of implementation. But it unraveled very quickly, in part because we were unable to get all countries that were significant emitters to sign up to those targets. Most importantly, the emerging economies like China and India, Brazil, South Africa, they didn't have any binding obligations under that treaty. The US did, but then quickly withdrew shortly after the agreement was adopted. Because of the change of administration, Republicans came in and said, well, this treaty doesn't seem fair to us. We worked on designing it, we influenced its shape, but now we don't want to join it. Sounds like a similar story that happened more recently with the Paris Agreement, which is the most latest iteration of an attempt to address this problem through specific commitments applicable to all parties. I won't get into the details of what the Paris Agreement says or does because I have only a brief introduction time, but we can get into in conversation. But I would just put that into the context of what happened in New York last week. So it was the United Nations Climate Action Summit. As you know, as students or observers of international policy, In New York at this time of year, the international heads of state and government convene in New York for the opening of the General Assembly. And occasionally, the Secretary-General, to exercise some leadership, attaches a particular theme to that General Assembly. And this year, it was a UN Climate Action Summit that was aimed at achieving two things. One was to provide a platform for a growing groundswell of concern and desire to act on the behalf of what we call non-state actors. So the youth movements, the local authorities, civil society, wanting to do more, calling on their leaders to do more, but also companies, multinational corporations that are concerned about the impact of climate change on economy and their business plans and their business strategies. There was a platform provided by the ESG for them to make announcements, to make calls upon governments to act more, to say what they were going to do. And the other thing that was very important about this meeting, and I'm sure Anna will talk about this as well, is to try to fix a problem with the latest generation of climate agreement, the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement achieved universality and the application of commitments to all parties by allowing each party to the agreement to design its own target. So we have under the Paris Agreement these nationally determined contributions, which are a reflection of what each party thought, each country, each government, thought was an ambitious and fair contribution to the Paris Agreement. The moment those targets were first expressed and aggregated as part of the Paris Agreement negotiations, it became very evident that they weren't strong enough, they weren't ambitious enough to actually put us on track to securing a safe climate system and a safe planet. So we decided, even as the Paris Agreement was adopted, that between now and 2020, we would put pressure on governments to come back with new and revised and stronger targets. And so the second thing that the Climate Action Summit was designed for was to create a pressure point for governments to announce their intent to raise their existing targets under the Paris Agreement. And let me leave the story there because I've gotten my warning, and there's plenty to follow up on from that.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah, so I will certainly build on that, but I want to start off with a quote really quickly, and this is from the UN Secretary-General at the close of the summit. This morning, we have heard overwhelming commitment to low carbon and climate resilient pathways. Change is in the air. The race is on, and you are leading by example. All must act and act together. Let the future look back on this as the day we decided to put our house in order for future generations. That's a powerful quote. Unfortunately, that was a quote made by Ban Ki-moon at the end of the 2014 Climate Summit. Now we're 5 years on, and it can be difficult to see how progress is being made, especially because the science has become even clearer. 1.5 degrees requires at least a net zero by 2050, if not heading into net negative pathways. And it also requires peaking within the next 15 months. And it requires a 45 to 55% reduction in emissions by 2030. That requires rapid transformational change. And yes, now we're back at a pivot point where we have a chance to really change and to ratchet up and increase ambition. And there are groups of countries that are leading. The European Union is leading in this respect. They have committed to net zero, and there are a number of countries that are moving in that direction, but we also know that that's not enough. And it also really depends on the pathways that they're using to get there. So I work with the poorest and most vulnerable countries as well. And we all know that even with 1.5 degrees warming, there is not enough ambition in terms of providing the most vulnerable countries with adaptation and resilience. And adaptation and resilience is really critical for these least developed communities. Even with 1.5 degrees, there is a tremendous amount of loss. I mean, even over the past 50 years, if you look at disasters globally, 18% were in least developed countries. But that also led to something like 69% of global deaths for disaster losses. These are societies that really can't respond to disasters in the same way that the United States can. If you look at what happened in the Bahamas just the past few days, they're not an LDC, but the level of destruction that happened there requires, I think, a bold investment by the international community. And we also, while there were some really positive potential commitments by the international community on international climate finance. You see doubling of pledges to the GCF, which is a really positive step, and $100 million pledged to LDCs and SIDS from a very interesting country, Qatar, which was a bit unexpected. I think that the scale of climate finance isn't at a level that's necessary to meet the needs of the most vulnerable countries. Just to achieve LDC's nationally determined contributions alone will require $93.7 billion in the next per year from 2020. And the international climate finance commitment is for $100 billion. So it's not sufficient to meet the needs that are out there. So I would really like to take hope from the summit, but I also see what happened in 2014 and see the commitments that were made there, and didn't see that necessarily translate into what is required by science. And so I'm very concerned.
Okay, thank you. John, I'll turn to you next.
All right, as a law professor and as a lawyer, I have to start out with a number of caveats and disclaimers, of course. I should clarify that I am not representing the petitioners in this case that's been filed with the Committee on the Rights of the Child. I was engaged as an expert advisor specifically on international human rights law by the law firm that's representing the petitioners. And the petitioners include Greta Thunberg, but also 15 other children from around the world. So I'm not their legal representative. I'm not speaking on their behalf. I'm speaking purely in my personal academic capacity. And as it is an ongoing, a pending case, there are limits to what I can say, and I certainly can't talk about the advice that I gave to the law firm, but I'm happy to discuss the significance of the case and explain a bit about the framework that's been utilized in bringing this communication to the committee. First of all, the Committee on the Rights of the Child is one of the human rights treaty bodies in the UN human rights system. If you're not familiar with the treaty bodies, they are committees that are established by each of the different human rights treaties, and their job is to monitor implementation of the treaty. Very important for human rights treaties because they're not based on a reciprocal exchange of rights and obligations between states that you would find in, say, a treaty that allows respective parties to use each other's fisheries jurisdiction, right? There, each state party has a material stake in compliance by the other state's parties. For human rights treaties, the beneficiaries are the people of that state most typically. So states don't have the same sort of material stake in compliance with human rights treaties. You don't have the same quid pro quo that you would have in, for example, commercial treaties or aviation rights treaties and things like that. So for human rights treaties, it's very important to establish this third-party monitoring body, this independent body that examines what states parties are doing to see if they're complying with their obligations under the treaty. So the Committee on the Rights of the Child, its mandate, monitor states parties' compliance with the treaty, making sure that the states parties are taking steps to respect and ensure the rights of all children that are subject to their jurisdiction. This is the most widely ratified human rights treaty in the UN system. So of all the different human rights treaties, the Convention on the Rights of the Child has the highest number of states parties, 196 states parties, which includes all of the UN member states except one, and then even some non-member states. And you may know the only UN member state that is not a party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child is the United States. But every other country in the world is a party to this landmark human rights treaty. Now, the treaty establishes this body and gives it competence to monitor state party behavior. Are they taking steps to ensure the rights of children? It does not, in the treaty, create a complaints mechanism. There's a separate supplemental treaty called the Third Optional Protocol to the Convention that creates procedures for accountability. Someone raised the issue of enforcement. Enforcement may be too strong a word for what the committee can do. It has no power to compel states. It's not the same thing as a court in a domestic legal system. But it does have what's sometimes called a quasi-judicial capacity with respect to those states that are not only parties to the treaty, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also to this additional protocol. This additional protocol creates an individual complaints procedure that looks a lot like a court case. And the committee looks like it's functioning as a court, that they're sitting essentially as judges, because individuals can bring complaints to the committee alleging that a state party to the protocol is not complying with its obligations under the Human Rights Treaty. It's failing to do what's required to respect and ensure the rights of all children subject to the jurisdiction of that state party. The protocol also creates some other procedures as well. Again, I wouldn't call them enforcement mechanisms so much as accountability mechanisms. It's a way of holding states to account for the non-fulfillment of their obligations under the treaty. Petitioner brings a complaint, the state party gets to respond, the committee makes a decision on whether or not the state party is complying with its obligations under the treaty, and then it renders its views. The views are, strictly speaking, not legally binding. It's not like the decision of a court, but the parties to the protocol have the obligation to give due consideration to those views, and they have to respond to the committee on what they are doing or not doing to comply with those views. So there's an accountability mechanism, there's an obligation to respond, there's an obligation to justify their behavior, and the committee also has a follow-up mechanism where it reviews the state's party's compliance and reports on it back to the General Assembly, and thus to all member states of the United Nations. This case would be jurisprudentially very significant. In addition to this accountability function, it would be very significant in advancing the jurisprudence, the committee's interpretation of the convention, because it's the first climate change case being brought under the framework of the Convention on the Rights of the Child.
2 more minutes.
Okay. So, by squarely placing this issue in the context of human rights, we're shifting the lens to a human rights lens, making clear that first and foremost, this is a human rights crisis. That as much as we talk about states and governments and corporations, at the end of the day, it's all about people and the impact it has on individual human beings. So, again, this is significant for a number of reasons, including this advancing the jurisprudence of the human rights treaty bodies on this issue. There are a few aspects of it that, in particular, apart from the shift to the human rights framework for understanding the impacts of climate change, there's also the fact that this petition is being brought on behalf of 16 children spread across the globe. It's not your typical case where it's an individual within a state bringing a case against that particular state party. So again, we have a global set of petitioners. We also have multiple respondent states. It's not just against a single state, it's against 5 states, all of whom are parties both to the convention and to this optional protocol on the communications procedure, underscoring first that responsibility here is collective. They are each individually responsible, but there is also a collective responsibility dimension because of the nature of the harms caused by climate change and the nature of the mechanism for causing those harms. And also that there is an obligation of international cooperation. That's another aspect of this collective dimension, that those states are also obliged to cooperate with each other, and even more so, have obligations to influence other states to comply with their obligations under the treaty.
Thank you. Thank you for those opening statements. I appreciate a lot of content and a lot of brevity, which I appreciate because it allows us then to get into more of a discussion. I have a number of questions that I'd like to ask, I won't be greedy and ask them all, but I will ask a few. And what I'd love to do is, some of these are for an individual one of you, and if so, I'll ask you. But otherwise, whoever would like to answer the question, I would really love to have the question answered. So, one of the things, Jake, that you talked about, actually, Jake and Anna, you both gave us glimpses of moments in history that sound sadly familiar to the moment that we are in now, especially in the context of the United States. Is there something inherently, structurally different, exceptional, important, annoying about the US, its democratic structure, its overall power, that makes our country, and perhaps a couple of others, unlikely, unable, unimpingible in terms of participating in a global agreement like this? Does that question make sense? So, and if so, then how does one ever bring the big players to the table and get this done?
I mean, I can start. The Paris Agreement was really structurally designed to bring the U.S. in. One of the reasons why... But
then it didn't, because we had a change
right.
in leadership, and that seems to be a pattern that we've seen before.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that is an inherent lesson in the Paris Agreement, is that even if you make an exceptional effort to compromise, but this lesson could have been learned from Kyoto. But I think that there was a really strong desire to have a universal agreement, in particular at that particular moment in time, because it was necessary to break the firewall between developed and developing countries that was created by the Kyoto Protocol.
Say a little bit more about what you mean by that firewall.
So the Kyoto Protocol required legally binding commitments, emission reduction commitments from developed countries, but it did not do that for developing countries. And however, with emissions evolving, and that firewall was created for a very important reason. There is historical responsibility that has been created through the emissions of industrial countries over time. And as a result, industrialized countries agreed to go first and to start reducing emissions. The convention embeds that principle within it. And so the Kyoto Protocol was very much based on that. And however, over time, particularly with the major emitters, emissions increasing very rapidly, it became necessary to reach an agreement that brought all emitters to the table. And so in that respect, the Paris Agreement wasn't just about getting the U.S. to the table. The U.S., of course, is an important emitter, but it was also about bringing right. China and India and all of the other major emitters into a legally binding agreement. Now, the consequence of that, of essentially bringing those emitters in, is that then the emission reductions are non-legally binding themselves. Mm-hmm. Submitting a nationally determined contribution is legally binding. The targets within them are not.
Who else would like to answer? Anyone?
I mean, I think that the U.S. relationship with multilateralism has always been based on the theory that if the U.S. designs something that works for itself, it will use multilateralism to extend that approach to other countries. And that was, the real kind of post-war effort to set up the United Nations system, to set up the Bretton Woods institutions, were all driven by the United States, but with a view to bringing the U.S.'s approaches to democracy and liberal markets through international instruments to other countries. You see similar patterns in the area of international environmental law as well. So when following on from the beginnings of the Endangered Species Act in this country, the U.S. was a big leader. In fact, it's one of the few conventions that has Washington associated with it in the development of the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, to essentially ensure that if the U.S. was going to manage endangered species, so would the rest of the world. You see that pattern with the Montreal Protocol, where when U.S. industry decided to phase out, for environmental purposes, the production and consumption of ozone-depleting substances, the U.S. was a big pusher behind the Montreal Protocol to extend those same obligations to other countries. With climate change, we have not seen the U.S. domestically take the action necessary to get carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions under control. So the dynamic of multilateralism flips. It becomes something that appears to be an imposition from the outside world, whether it's Europeans trying to impose their standards on the United States, or it's China trying to impose standards on the United States that China would then be unwilling to follow. It flips that dynamic. And I think that's the structural issue around the United States' relationship with climate change and with multilateralism. So, an individual administration can make progress on the negotiation of a treaty. They bring it home, and Congress says, you've got to be kidding. We haven't already legislated in this area. You're expecting us to ratify an agreement that would require us to legislate profound transformations in our economy. It doesn't work that way. So, which means that for all of you that clearly care about this issue, it's got to start, the fight has got to start at home in this country. All that the youth movement on the street has to convert into people voting for representatives that care about this issue locally, federally, and then legislate on it. And then I think the U.S. will become a more reliable partner. Under Obama, unfortunately, they didn't get that legislation in place, and it was very easy for the new administration simply to switch off all the switches that Obama switched on, and we're kind of back at square one in this country now in terms of addressing.
So given that answer, and I mean that answer up to the part about switching off and on, I'm going to build on that to ask a question that was part of the learning agenda we heard from the audience at the beginning. Given what you've just said, is there actually really anything different to trying to negotiate international or multilateral agreements under the Trump administration than any other administration in the United States in the last 50 years?
I don't know if the Trump administration is interested in anything multilateral. They're interested in bilateral trade agreements, but someone might be following this more closely. I mean, they clearly aren't interested in Paris. The president announced his intent to withdraw. That request will become formal in a month or so, and the U.S. will be out by the early November of next year. Montreal Protocol the U.S. is still in. They are participating in the ICAO process to regulate emissions from commercial aviation, but in a very kind of subtle way, not really expressing much leadership, but agreeing to continue to remain in. I think because they realize that U.S. commercial airlines will really only remain competitive if passengers get the sense that they're participating in regulating their emissions, and ICAO provides an opportunity to do that.
Okay. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, and so U.S. multilateralism has always been self-interested, but that's not so different from how other states use. I mean, the reason they participate in it, the reason they cooperate is because it's in their self-interest to do so, and the U.S. as a great power, its configuration of interests are a bit different. And yes, historically, it has used multilateral treaties to project U.S. standards internationally. We saw that certainly in the context of human rights. And when human rights bodies started telling the U.S., actually, you're not complying with your obligations, it was a bit of a shock. It's like, no, we invented human rights, and then we spread it to the rest of the world. What do you mean we're not complying? So in getting the U.S. to ratify human rights treaties has been exceedingly difficult, and domestic civil society organizations have traditionally used something that is referred to as stealth ratification. Basically, if they want the U.S. to become a party to a human rights treaty, they first have to lobby for domestic changes without reference to international law. But for domestic policy reasons, the law should be changed to this to make sure that the U.S. is already complying with what the treaty requires. Then it's a much softer sell to say, we're already doing everything. We won't have to change anything about our domestic system, and yet it will add to the prestige of this human rights instrument so more other states who really need this will buy into the system because they'll see the U.S. on the committee, et cetera. But even that is changing. And I would agree, it's not so much the executive that's been the holdup historically, it's been the Senate. right? And a few years ago, the U.S. had signed the Convention on the Rights of All Persons with Disabilities, submitted it to the Senate for its advice and consent to the U.S. to ratify, and the Senate did not give its advice and consent. And this is a treaty that was largely based on U.S. domestic law, largely based on the ADA and court standards, jurisprudence developing those standards, and the Senate would still refuse to give its advice and consent. It was really this ideological opposition to multilateral cooperation on these kinds of issues.
Go ahead, keep going.
A real quick addition to that. The Paris Agreement was very carefully negotiated by the U.S. delegation to specifically avoid the advice and consent issue. The Paris Agreement was, the U.S. was able to sign on and ratify the Paris Agreement without the advice and consent of the Senate, because it does not contain, its process is legally binding, but the substance of the emission reductions are not legally binding.
Right. And to the extent that the U.S. made a commitment, it was based on an assessment of what it could achieve through its existing legislation, through the Clean Air Act. But I just wanted to push back. I do think the U.S. is quite exceptional in its approach to multilateralism. Many other governments, and this is true of the EU, want the top-down drive. They need to get that signal from above to assure them that their partners are working as well on these objectives, but also to empower the constituencies within to point to that international agreement and then to drive the development of legislation. In my observation, I think the U.S. approach, which is to engage, shape, and then walk away, is quite unique.
All right, a couple of other questions. Please, in the audience now, please begin to start thinking about the questions you'd like to ask the panelists. I'll probably do 2 or 3 more, and then we'll bring the microphone out and we'll start turning to you. I think it's arguable that we are witnessing a time, particularly, although maybe not exclusively or just particularly in Western countries, where we're seeing a rise of nationalism. How does a rise of nationalism, particularly when it gains larger traction in a country, affect the long-term prospects and ability to collaborate globally on climate change?
Yeah, I would say to the extent it dovetails with this ideological opposition to multilateral efforts, then of course it's going to make those more difficult. And I would have to say that, again, coming back to this national self-interest thing, states do act in their national self-interest. My point is just it looks different when the U.S. does it because it's in an unusual position with respect to almost all the rest of the states in the world.
So what I'm looking for is to really give this some teeth. We are in a changing time. I heard in the audience, I want to feel hopeful. I want to know what actual steps that we can take. I found it really helpful to understand your perspectives on bilateral, multilateral, the U.S.'s general attitude. What are, given the current state of our global system, the rise of nationalism in many countries, the change in administration and approach here in the United States, what are the practical steps that can and have to happen in the next 12 to 18 months that aren't in that category of the phrase we use in my house is, oh, honey, that is never going to happen, right? That aren't in that category, but are in the category of, no, we could actually do this in the next 12 to 18 months.
This is the call for sources of optimism and hope. Well, I mean, so in the EU, there's less conversation about nationalism and more about populism.
Okay.
And it's true that some populism, which is when a community or a group of individuals feels that the world is moving in a direction that's undermining their interests, that's putting them out of work, that's closing off their opportunities, associate that with a national identity, that something's happening outside of their country that's affecting them in this way, and therefore they connect populism with that notion that it becomes nationalism. But at least populism within the EU at the moment is happening at both ends of the political spectrum, and I think it's beginning to happen a bit that way in the United States as well. And the populism around demanding action on climate change, which is also associated with demanding action on clean air, demanding action on better infrastructure and public transportation and better housing, the demand for better jobs, safer and more challenging jobs. That's being associated with a green populism that is actually very powerful and growing in influence in the EU. And in fact, the European parliamentary elections produced a European Parliament that insisted that the next head of the European Commission, which is the federal government of the EU for which I work, have climate change as its #1 political priority. So the first 100 days of this new administration that will start on the 1st of November, we and my colleagues and I have to develop the first binding climate law in the EU that includes a binding obligation to ensure that the European Union is the first region, well, hopefully not the first region to commit to climate neutrality by 2050. So net zero emissions by 2050, binding in law, if the new president, supported by the new parliament, supported by the elections, is able to follow through on that. Now, there will be pushback because there's populism on the right, and some of that populism on the right is associated with communities that feel disenfranchised in part by, and resonates in this country as well, by a movement away from fossil fuels and a movement away from traditional industrialized sectors of the economy. But I derive a lot of optimism from the fact that populism seems to be turned to good, not just local good, but also global good through some of these movements. Greta Thunberg is an example and a leader on that. She's the one who's getting students out into the street every Friday in Brussels and in other capitals and cities in Europe. So I derive some optimism to that, and they do link it back to Paris. A lot of because if you want to solve this climate change problem, as we all said in the outset, you can't do it. The EU going climate neutral is not going to have any effect on global average temperature. You have to persuade others to come along as well, and the multilateral instruments are the source of hope. Maybe a little naive, but still the source of hope that will happen.
Go ahead.
And here in the U.S., I would say, forget the Trump administration. Look to state and local level communities. The action that is happening at the local level and at the state level in many cases is profound. There's a coalition here in the U.S. that is working to mobilize coalitions of the willing, so communities that want to take action on climate resilience, want to take action on climate mitigation. And if Trump is reelected, they are on track to meet the U.S.'s first nationally determined contribution. So it's, yes, that NDC needs to be revised upwards. We need the U.S. to be able to take action at the national level. There's no question about that. But don't discount what can be done locally here in the U.S.
I would say messaging, and simple messaging that demonstrates to people that this is in their self-interest, and something that's not emotional, that's not polarizing. Unfortunately, a lot of the messaging that we hear is polarizing, it's aggressive, it's attacking, it's making people feel defensive. It's not effective. I mean, we saw that also in the Brexit vote, right? I mean, there was a failure to communicate to people that it really is in their self-interest to stay within the European Union. It was a failure to demonstrate that, in a phrase my colleague used in this context, that it was a tide that raises all boats. And that did not effectively come across. And the voices that were saying, the ideological opposition, blame Brussels for everything, blame, these other
Fascist bureaucrats.
Right, exactly. So again, just simple, objective, factual messages that people can see. People are not bad. People will want to do things that are in their own good and everybody else's good. People want a tide that's going to raise all boats, that's going to help everybody. But the messaging has to be understandable, tangible, and non-polarizing.
Okay, my last question before we turn it over to the audience. And if we can try to do just on this one, 30-second answers, just so that they don't have to wait too much longer. When I ran one of the organizations I ran, we used to have this thing we called the stupid rule, And we were always looking for the stupid rule, which was some rule out there that kept us from doing the work or the good that we wanted to do, that was actually one of those that was just stupid. And with a little attention or work, we could eliminate it and it would break a logjam. Are there, and the answer may be none, but usually there are. Is there a stupid rule that, from your perspective, is out there, and if we could go after it realistically and knock that one stupid rule down, we could make significant progress? Go ahead.
I mean, to me, it's the absence of a rule. So it's in, and this is just in the US context, carbon dioxide is not recognized as a pollutant.
That's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. Okay, what else? Anna, anything?
We need to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies.
Okay.
We are putting a lot of investment into fossil fuels still.
Exactly.
And this, if tomorrow, I think the single most impactful thing would be eliminating all fossil fuel subsidies.
Also the kind of thing I was asking about. Excellent. John, anything from your perspective?
No,
All right, are you ready? Yes, for questions? I have no idea how we're going to do this, but we'll figure it out as we go along. I have a first hand over here. Do you want to bring the, are you going to be the microphone delivery person? Yes, I am. Okay, let's do it. Doctor, go ahead. Actually, you know what? I'm sorry. Could I ask you to wait just a moment? If you need to leave, this is a time you could do that. And if you are sitting in an uncomfortable position and would like to stand up for a moment and shake your legs out, this would also be a time to do that. Let's just get this done, and then we can sit down and work our way into Q&A. I knew it was going to happen anyway, so let's just let it happen, and then we can have an intimate conversation with those who remain.
So my question to you is the masterminds behind this strategy, and where is it? Is it backed by a particular foundation? Was it sort of spontaneously conceived by the individual plaintiffs, or
we can go ahead and get back to
is that something you can disclose?
People will be able to be more relaxed and comfortable now. And so, please, Doctor, go ahead with your questions.
So I want to pick up on your last point about fossil fuels. The evidence is very clear that fossil fuels, the combustion of fossil fuels with the emission of carbon dioxide is a major driver of climate change. It's also, of course, a major source of the particulates, the sulfur, the sulfates, the oxides of nitrogen, that account for something like 7 million deaths around the world every year. So clearly, fuel transition is a critical issue. Now, I've seen some economic projections, but I'm not an economist. And the projections are arguing that within 2 to 3 to 5 years, it's actually going to be cheaper to produce electricity from wind and solar than from coal or oil or gas. So my question is quite simple. Number one, do you think those projections are credible? And number two, how do you think that markets and investors are going to react to that, to those price points?
And is there a particular person you'd like to have answer that question, or is it to the whole panel?
The panel.
Great, thank you. Who'd like to go?
Sure. In many countries, it's already cheaper to produce electricity with wind and solar. It is subsidies that are keeping that from happening in other jurisdictions. Now, it is cheaper, I think, in many places in Europe, and it's cheaper here in the United States in some jurisdictions. But it is that is not necessarily the case in many developing countries where access to technology is much more complicated. And so I think that there's a huge role for the international community and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change process and the Paris Agreement to change those numbers through technology transfer.
Yeah. Would agree with that. I mean, it's geographically specific. So, for some countries, for example, Japan always argues that it's very costly for it to install significant wind because of the topography of the island. Very steep inland and then very steep downwards offshore. So in those circumstances, those specific circumstances, it may be a little bit tougher for wind to compete. But very famously, there's been some high-profile contracts put out to bid in the Gulf region for the supply of energy, and solar and wind. Solar in this circumstance beat out natural gas hands down in terms of the price that it was able to deliver the same kilowatts.
So I'm gonna cue us up. I know we've got a question here. Raise your hand, wave your hand, please. And sir, I think you do too. So we'll do, and you there in the glasses, and you. So I'm gonna stop at 4 for now. That's our cue. I'll come back to you. Don't worry. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we'll go from there.
Hello. Oh, first of all, thank you guys for coming. My question is, how consequential is the upcoming U.S. election in staying in the Paris Agreement and making progress in climate change? And then also, will staying in the Paris Agreement be enough, or do we need a new agreement with legally binding commitments and greater finance for these less developing countries?
Anyone in particular, or
Just the whole panel.
Okay. Who would like to answer?
Look, the U.S. election is the difference between the U.S. being out of the Paris Agreement for at least 4 years and being out of the agreement for 3 months. So I do think it's consequential, but the Paris Agreement is also necessary but not sufficient means of tackling climate change. We need to massively leverage the private sector. We need all segments of society moving rapidly towards transformational change. And the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change process, because it requires consensus of 197 countries, is inherently a conservative and slow process. So it's never going to move fast enough. Necessary, not sufficient.
Okay. Over here on the other side. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Brad. I'm a student at the Tufts Institute of the Environment. My question is, since we have the new IPCC requiring or emphasizing on countries going from 2.0 goal to 1.5, and there's a lot of uncertainty that comes with that. And then you have powerful, not wealthy countries like Saudi Arabia coming together with Iran, which they never do, to eliminate the IPCC report from being negotiated formally. The first question is that, do you think that uncertainty should be taken a lot more than just a fact sometimes when we talk about climate change? And the second one is, how would you negotiate that differently with the Saudis to allow the IPCC report to be negotiated? That's my two questions to the whole.
Thank you. Go ahead, John.
If I could just say something in terms of the human rights complaint that we filed. Now, a caveat, again, I'm not a climate expert, I'm a human rights expert. Nonetheless, what we argued within this human rights complaint is that human rights law, to be properly interpreted in this context, has to take account of rules and principles of international environmental law, including the precautionary principle. So that a proper interpretation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child in this context means you have to consider this principle that just because the science is uncertain doesn't mean you don't have to take precautions. For any law students here, you may recall the learned hand formula, the notion that you have to look at the probability of the harm as well as the gravity of the harm to determine what the measures you need to take to prevent that harm, the extent of the measures you need to take.
There are like 17 people cracking up in this. Okay.
So in this context, First, it's important to acknowledge the uncertainty surrounding the science, but you also have to look that the probability that it's right is increasing, and we've seen a trajectory of greater and greater certainty about the science. And you also, in addition to that, have to take into account the gravity of the harm, and the harm is looking extremely grave. And both of those have to be taken into account to determine to what extent you need to take precautions. And so, of course, that features prominently in the brief for the complaint.
Would either of you like to add anything in response to the two questions?
Well, I mean, we have a principle called the Precautionary Principle in international environmental law that essentially says that in circumstances where there is a grave risk, but there isn't certainty in terms of the science of that around that risk, that should not prevent you from taking action. And that principle is reflected in the Framework Convention, the Paris Agreement. It was a lot more relevant when the science was less certain. So back in the 1990s, that principle was essential to getting the negotiations off the ground. Now, there is no uncertainty with regard to the fact that the temperature is rising and it's due to human activity. There is some uncertainty in terms of when exactly we will see what temperature rises and how those will have impacts in particular regions and countries. But there is no uncertainty that should prevent at this stage any country from acting. The Paris Agreement includes the 1.5 degree goal within its framework. So when countries are designing their nationally determined contributions, when they're figuring out what's my target going to be on Paris, they're supposed to take into account the planetary boundaries of a 1.5 degree temperature rise. Very few of them did that in the first round. We're hoping that by 2020, more will have come back with targets that more reflecting the science. And we think, equally importantly, that they come forward with these long-term strategies towards climate neutrality. Because what the 1.5 degree report from the IPCC said is that we all have to be at climate neutral by essentially 2080. But some of us have to be there a lot sooner, particularly the large industrialized countries, in order to give space for others to get there more gradually. The EU's long-term strategy, which is still being debated a bit, but looks like will be submitted early next year, is based on the 1.5 degree report. So it contains pathways that model us from where we are now to where we need to be net zero in our emissions by 2050. And it's not easy. It's not easy.
Okay, let's go to the glasses in the back row there.
Okay. Yeah, that actually kind of dovetails nicely in my question because you've all alluded several times to like the insufficiency of the NDCs currently, but that's not altogether a huge surprise because a huge part of the Paris bet was that it would be
Just a touch
ratchet
louder, just a
effect.
little
There'd be a
louder.
ratchet effect over time. So I guess my question is sort of two parts. What does like Paris specify? Like, what's the process supposed to look like? And then like, or is that actually happening? What's sort of the status currently?
It is happening. We hope. We haven't seen we haven't seen the next round of NDCs. So in advance of Paris, countries submitted their INDCs, and then after Paris, most of these were converted directly into NDCs. But NDCs are submitted sort of 5 years in advance of when they're actually due, and so the notion is that countries at this point in time should be potentially able to enhance that first round of NDCs, in addition to submitting new 2025 NDCs when they submitted an NDC that only went out to 2025 instead of 2030. So I guess the best thing to say on the ratchet mechanism is stay tuned. Look for the next round of NDCs. I have high hopes for ratcheting by countries, for instance, within the European Union, and I have no hope of others.
And the EU is 9% of global emissions, so we can make other people feel good about what we're doing, but it's not going to have the impact that's necessary. So we're going through the first informal ratchet now, and so the Climate Action Summit was a boost to try to complete that by 2020. The first formal ratchet actually takes place as part of the global stocktake that's included in the Paris Agreement that will happen in 2023, 2024 to deliver new targets in 2025. That's designed to essentially spell out the targets for most parties between 2030 and whatever time frame they choose, 5 or 10 or 15 years.
Depends
from
on what
from
the
that
common
that,
time frames
that point on. We haven't decided whether we're all going to have the same time frame or not. I mean, the hopes for this first informal ratchet lie with what happens in this country more than anything else, because the timing of when a new administration or a new Congress would be able to signal as to what they plan to do next on climate policy is in that same time frame where every other party is expected to deliver a new NDC. The EU is moving under its own momentum, but I think countries like China, which any analyst could tell you could do more than what they committed to under Paris, might be holding back to see whether or not they can get into some kind of bargaining deal, hopefully a virtual one-upmanship rather than the other direction, with the world's second largest emitter. China's the first largest, the US is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and so that's when the political moment in the near term will change, hopefully in the right direction.
Okay, before we go to my next question, which is the next row forward, I also then have you in queue, you in queue, you there in queue, and we'll go you, sir, in queue. Those will be my next 4, so that you know what to plan on. We are either going till the questions run out or 6:30, whichever one comes first. So you can kind of decide how you want to live your life for the next half an hour. Okay, right here.
So this is I guess, a practical question, and I guess you guys focus more on a macro-ish level, right? Like looking at international sphere. But I'm curious because, I hear of this issue of climate, the crisis, and all of these other issues, and you get educated a lot about it, right? We talk a lot about these issues, but in terms of a practical individualist activist, so in a point of view, what can I actually do about it, right? Because I can understand the issues with dropping out a Paris Agreement and all the other sorts of issues and all of these climate issues that we're not addressing, but as an individual, what is my role in that? What can I do? We talked a little bit, I guess, about state and local government, and I think a lot of people like to talk about, just vote. It's true, but beyond an individual vote, beyond political campaigning, what are the practical steps to take, right? When I come out of this meeting, instead of just being angry about it, being angry is good only insofar as it turns into action.
Okay.
So I'm just curious. Yeah.
Good. Who would like to answer?
So this is actually a question that I had addressed in the class that I spoke to earlier, and I think that everybody can take. Look, of course, we need the dramatic, transformational, whole of society change, which does require legislation and political action, as well as engagement by social movements. However, I think that there's a lot of scope for individual action, and I think that individual action on climate change, reducing your personal emissions, not everybody's going to be able to reduce their emissions in their own way. As somebody who tracks the negotiations very closely, I fly way more than I should, but everybody can reduce their own emissions in their own ways, and they can also engage around emission reductions and adaptation within their lives and communities. How is the organization that you work for addressing climate change? Do they have a plan to adapt to climate change? How are they reducing their carbon emissions? If you're working in finance, can you decarbonize your investment streams? There are so many ways that each of us can contribute to this work, and we all need to be pitching in and doing our best to ensure that the entire society, including all of the institutions around us that we interact with on a daily basis, are reducing their emissions. This includes your grocery stores. This includes literally every facet of our lives need to change. And because of that, there's a lot of scope for action and involvement.
Before we go to the next question, let me ask, how many of you in here are working with an organization or on a project that is practical that somebody else in this room could get involved in? Raise your hands. Okay, so raise them high so everyone can see you. When we are done at 6:30, if you're interested in getting engaged in any of those, or if you'd like to hear about them, you can meet here. And those of you who are interested in some social action getting engaged, if the others who just raised their hands would come stand over here and make yourselves available to share your opportunities, that would probably be of service to the rest of the room. Okay, so 6:30, right here. Especially BC undergrads, right here, 6:30. Okay, sir, you're the next question.
All right, so
Let's bring you the mic. That's just a little harder to hear over than that.
my question pertains to nuclear energy. To anyone in the panel, it seems like a lot of the alternatives to fossil fuels that are mentioned are like predominantly hydro, solar, and wind. Yet nuclear is kind of left behind, despite the fact that it has a lot more efficiency, I guess, than those other forms of energy. And it doesn't have, I guess, these drawbacks you see in solar with the pollution that goes in the manufacturing of panels. So I was wondering why there seems to be a lack of advocacy for nuclear energy.
Okay.
In terms
And it's to the whole panel, right?
Anyone who wishes to answer it.
Okay.
Well, I mean, there is no lack of advocacy for nuclear energy from the nuclear industry. And they are right in saying that they are going to be part of the climate change solution. I mean, if I just look at the European experience again, we have different member states with very different attitudes about nuclear. Some have been dependent upon it very significantly and will continue to be, like France. Others are rapidly trying to phase it out, like Germany. And the reason why the Germans want to phase it out is because of the environmental footprint beyond climate change, that they're concerned about the management of the waste, the risks associated obviously with spent fuel, et cetera. But all of our modeling in terms of how we get to net zero in the EU includes a slice for nuclear, because there isn't a technology yet that gives us confidence, a known technology that can provide that base load of energy within the European economic structure that could replace nuclear. But it's small. I mean, we're talking about 80% renewables in the classic sense, and I think it's like 8 or 9% renewables nuclear in terms of where we at the point at which we decarbonize. But don't worry, there are many advocates out there that are pushing for nuclear.
Okay, over here.
My question was, it seems that the hope is to reduce emissions, and if for the next 50 years, the objectives are not met, what do climate negotiations in the sort of long-term future, decades from now, look like? Does there reach a point where there is no longer a path to reduce emissions enough that the science says that there's a viable future, and is there a backup plan for say 3-4 decades from now?
That's a depressing.
I don't know. Well, we had an interesting conversation about if we reduce emissions enough, and we actually overshoot. At what point do you start negotiations on where to actually settle the climate, because obviously you don't want to send it into an ice age. But I sort of looked at somebody, I was like, yeah, we don't need to worry about that for a couple hundred years at least. So, yeah.
Was that your concern, or the concern that when it's clear that we failed, what do we continue to negotiate? I mean, I think we will probably continue to negotiate. I mean, even some of the modeling talks about overshoot and return, which also would need to be managed. So if we plow right through 1.5 and 2, that doesn't mean that we can't then try to negotiate increasing our ability to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. There are discussions about geoengineering, including solar radiation management. That if that technology is ever deployed at scale, it's got to be governed, and it would have to be governed by some kind of international regime. And of course, there's a lot of talk, and there has been since 1992, about how do you cooperate on adaptation? How can we work together to help those communities that Anna's working with on a regular basis, and I used to work with many years ago, that are experiencing the impacts now, and some of those impacts may be irreversible. Is there a means of helping them through international cooperation? That conversation is well underway.
Next question, I think you can just, it's right next door.
Hi. I was wondering if you see a relationship between the disproportional distribution of resources, be they political resources, economic resources, natural resources, either on an individual, community, or country level, and the level of serious and existential concern about climate change versus the assumption that entities can protect just themselves and be essentially exempt from the impacts of climate change.
I really apologize. I actually had trouble following that question, and if I did, people in the audience, I don't mean to embarrass you, but I did. And so could I just ask you to ask it one more time, please?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Do you see any connection between the disproportional distribution of resources on any level, be it individual or large-scale country level, and the level of concern that that entity has for climate change? Do they believe that they are exempt from the effects of climate change or things that have purchased their way out, or do they have an existential concern? Do you see a relationship between those two dynamics?
Thank you. That was very helpful. I appreciate it. Yes.
Climate justice.
Yeah, I mean, we do have some of the petitioners in this case are indigenous, and of course they're a more vulnerable community, more often than not marginalized in domestic politics, have less of a voice, and there are special protections for indigenous communities in international law, and specifically in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So of course there's that aspect where they're more vulnerable, and they're also the ones who are seeing the harms induced by climate change now. For example, that we have one who is a Sami petitioner who is not going to be able to be a reindeer herder, which her family or her culture has been doing for thousands of years, right? So this tradition, this cultural tradition, is disappearing. Similarly, we have Marshall Islanders who are facing similar problems. There's also, we have an Alaskan petitioner, so U.S. citizen, also indigenous, also being more impacted now and likely to be more greatly impacted going forward.
Okay, so before I get to you, which you're the last in this next queue. The next queue, I'll take 3. 1, 2, 3, because you were the first 3 hands I saw. I think I'll get to all 3 of you, but I am going to stick to the 6:30 hard stop, so I don't make absolute promises yet. Sir, please go ahead.
Okay, so sort of going off that question, people, especially with more wealth and more income, I don't know, I guess we never really sort of said, like, if all of us would feel like we're exempt from these issues, but, it seems to be that people in the global south especially, and more vulnerable, poorer countries are going to be the ones to suffer the brunt of these issues. So is there really a discussion about actual wealth redistribution? Like, countries like the United States or China or in the European Union sending technology and sending wealth and other resources without expecting anything in return? Like, is there sort of a discussion about what wealthier nations are going to do, not just within their own countries, but in terms of sending resources to other countries to either make them more resilient to climate change issues or to actually, develop with technology that is sustainable?
Thank you. And to the whole panel?
Yes, the whole panel.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there are huge risks here. There's a really excellent report that was put out recently by UN Secretary-General Special Rapporteur on Human Rights on the issue of climate apartheid, which is looking at the risk that communities in the global south face, particularly as the impacts start to really widen if resources aren't provided to support them to adapt to climate change, and if then as well wealthier countries start to harden borders to prevent migration. And I do think that those are very real risks. You look at what happened in the Bahamas. If you looked at what happened, for instance, after the earthquake in Haiti, people in desperate humanitarian crisis in Haiti were flown to the United States. They were airlifted to the United States for medical care and for support. And the Trump administration has prevented humanitarian humanitarian airlifts or ferry boats from the Bahamas to the United States. And this is something that we would traditionally do during a natural disaster. And so, you know, once you see that type of behavior, you start, I think that risk becomes sort of very, very tangible and real. So it's a huge concern, and it will require a large investment by developed countries in adaptation and resilience in developing countries. There's no question about that.
I would just come back to self-interest. And if it's going to work, you have to be able to explain why it is in the self-interest of countries to do this. You can't rely just on a humanitarian impulse. Remember years ago when 30, 40 years ago, recycling first became a thing. I was with my undergrad environmental group, and I was very gung-ho about recycling. And one of my classmates said, well, if it's not convenient, people aren't going to do it. And I was like, how can you say that? But they were absolutely right. So we have to also think in practical terms, and a humanitarian impulse is not going to cut it.
Okay. You're next.
Yes, I was, hi. We spoke about this earlier in one of my classes. I want to know what do you see the impact of carbon markets and carbon taxes in playing to address the issues and meeting the benchmarks for the Paris Agreement? And what's your take, positive, and your critique, negative, about this particular type of mechanism? And what do you see as the whether it's being promoted or whether it's sort of being not really being contemplated as one of the alternatives or one of the solutions? Oh, entire thing.
I am the EU's lead negotiator on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is the rules on market mechanisms.
Don't you love it when that happens?
Well, I mean, first of all, every economist will tell you that in order to solve this problem, we have to put a price on carbon. Now, that can be literal in the form of a tax. It can be a little bit less literal in the terms of a cap-and-trade system, where in order to emit, you have to buy a permit, and that generates a price on carbon. Or it can be the regulatory effect of putting in place policies that make burning fossil fuels more expensive as an effect of that regulation. All of those can be described as putting a price on carbon. In the EU, we went early for cap and trade. And so one of the systems that we've had in place for over a decade and a half is a legally binding cap on emissions from the power sector and the manufacturing sector, which basically sets limits on those facilities so that they must reduce their emissions towards achieving a technological benchmark. If they emit more than that, they have to buy an allowance to cover that additional price. That system has operated extremely well to maintain the cap. What it's worked less well is to send a price signal that's high enough that actually drives technological innovation. That price, however, as we've been playing around with the system, has gone up, and it's now roughly 25 to 30 euros a ton within the EU, and we believe it's now beginning to affect the way in which companies invest long time in order to avoid the imposition of that. When the U.S. contemplated federal legislation on climate change the last time around, Werksman-Markey, it also had a cap-and-trade system on it. The politics in this country seem to be drifting back towards taxes. There's a lot of discussion on the Hill now of a potential energy tax that might have a strong carbon component to it. So it remains a popular policy. We would never see it as the silver bullet. In the EU, we combine a cap-and-trade policy together with renewable energy targets, energy efficiency targets, rules in terms of how you set standards for automobiles, which are absolutely critical to get CO2 under control. And so it's not a silver bullet in that sense. At the international level, the way in which carbon markets have operated in the past and will likely operate in the future is to try to promote investment across the border. So to give countries that have a high cost of compliance an opportunity to invest in countries where compliance is more cost effective, and for a certificate to be generated in the country of investment that can be then used in the country that's provided the resources to offset emissions. That existed under the Kyoto Protocol, something called the Clean Development Mechanism, and there's a similar kind of mechanism that's contemplated under the Paris Agreement. We are worried about carbon markets because although they've worked relatively effectively within national jurisdictions, there are a lot of perverse incentives and unintended outcomes that can come when you're joining two different jurisdictions to achieve the same outcome. A lot of the rules that we're developing under Paris now are trying to manage those risks in ways that I can't get into in detail now. But so they're not a silver bullet. When they do work well, they work well under quite constrained circumstances, and you have to keep a very close eye on them because they can produce some very perverse outcomes.
All right, for our last two questions, I'm going to use a technique I use with callers sometimes, which is I'm going to take both questions and then let the panelists answer across the two questions as they see fit. I think you were one of the two. Yep, so you ask your question.
Hi, thank you for coming. So my question is kind of an offshoot of the other questions that have been asked, focused on kind of the distribution and equity of climate change, and in particular for developing countries. So considering how little time we have and how much change needs to be taken, where do you draw the line between protecting the global climate and protecting the local ecosystems and communities that are affected by some, renewable infrastructure efforts such as hydropower, and how solar panels can have minerals that are very toxic for people to mine?
Great, and we'll take the other question at the same time, and then I'll right here in front in the plaid shirt, and then I'll let you guys answer across them, and then I'll have one closing question for each of you for a closing remark.
My question has to do with kind of U.S. domestic strategy. Mr. Werksman, you mentioned that the Montreal Protocol succeeded in getting the U.S. To the table because U.S. businesses had really pushed for it. What was it about that protocol that got U.S. industry behind it, and is it possible to kind of transfer that to the current situation when the stakes are so much higher?
Okay, who's going to answer the first question? Anna, it looks like you're ready.
Sure. So there are considerable trade-offs in climate change, and some climate change activities, some activities to mitigate climate change, have much more significant social and environmental consequences, and so the extent to which we need to be looking at solutions that work with nature, both in terms of adaptation and in terms of mitigation. So I think that's really the key. Yes, there are potentially some trade-offs that have to be made that cannot be avoided, but in many cases there are solutions that protect nature and conserve livelihoods, and also conserve sensitive cultures and communities and vulnerable communities. So I don't think that there is necessarily inconsistency.
Who would like to answer the second question?
Well, I guess it was kind of directed to me, but just on that, I mean, we are talking about a profound transformation. I mean, even for the EU, where we have a couple of decades of a start on managing climate change, it's a profound transformation which will have dislocational effects, whether it's dislocating biodiversity because we've decided that we want to invest in biofuels, and therefore we have to cut down some forests to plant some more soy to make sure that we use soy diesel rather than fossil fuels. And it can have the kind of impacts on communities as well. I mean, we have communities in the EU that are complaining about wind turbines. There's a not in my backyard effect of that as well. So it's a big change, and we don't know all the consequences, but they will be disruptive, and we have to take into account these justice impacts of the changes that we're driving through our policy. Montreal Protocol, very unique in the sense that the same companies that produced the chemicals that were the problem were the companies that produced the chemicals that were the solution. That's not the case in climate change. We do see some fossil fuel companies beginning to diversify and developing their renewable portfolios as well, but their main bread and butter for many of them, particularly at this point in time, is still the cheap production and sale of fossil fuels. So it's more of a challenge of divesting existing vested interests and vesting them elsewhere, and empowering the companies and the other parts of society that are providing the solutions. So it's harder, in short.
Okay, so my last question is the same question for each of you, and if you could spend a minute or so answering it, that'll take us right up to time. You're you, which is obvious, but at one point you were them. What is the one thing, if they want to be you, what is the one thing they might not know or think of to do or invest in or study or learn or not do, that because you're you now, you know, and they don't?
I mean, I spent way too much time in school, but I have 3 graduate degrees, but I also would not be where I am today if I hadn't gotten those degrees. So it's, yes, I spent too much time, but it's also the reason why I'm here today. So you can't win either way.
How about you, Jake?
Well, I guess I would say, whatever's attracted you to this conversation is based on something. It's not on everything, but there's something that you feel passionately about. Some of you will be passionate environmentalists. Some of you will be passionate about technologies. Some of you will be passionate about justice. Some of you will be passionate about international law. Think about what that thing is. Invest in that strength and be prepared to deploy it in whatever way chance and opportunity provides you to deploy it. It may not be climate change. It might be biodiversity. It might be working with your local community on some of the solutions that we talked about. So figure out what it is that is really driving you from this set of issues and pursue it. And then secondly, and we talked about this in the car on the way over, be prepared to volunteer. For many of the organizations that are doing the cutting edge work on this, they can't afford to pay brilliant people like you, well-educated people like you, as you enter the door. So be prepared to volunteer your time as a way in, and then demonstrate your indispensability, and then eventually you'll get paid for it as well.
If you want to do human rights work, if you want to take a human rights approach to these issues and use human rights as a tool, understand first and foremost that these are legal standards, and take a course, spend a little more time in school, take a course in international human rights law, and also, very importantly, understanding public international law. And then from there, know your stuff and follow your heart.
Excellent. All right, so in a moment, those who want to get involved and those who have opportunities to get involved can gather over here. But in the meantime, I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists for making the trip.